Hi folks, it is Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video, and for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and guitar tutor based in Southeast London. Today I'm very excited to be continuing my series about practical guitar and also music theory. Specifically, we are going to be looking at alternate chords today. Alternate chords are chords that are either major or minor, or sometimes not at all, and it's just a way of spicing up your chords, making them sound interesting. Now, at face value, this is going to be handy if you just want to start playing chords that sound a little bit more interesting, like major sevenths or dominant chords, and also other extensions. But this is actually going to be really handy later on when we switch gears and start focusing on songwriting and something called functional harmony. So this is great for songwriters too. So if this sounds interesting to you, please stay tuned. Please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to stay in the loop. And of course, it motivates me to keep making content like this. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. I have 200 plus subscribers now. I feel really good about that. And it was only about a year ago I really started asking people to subscribe, and I didn't do it for a long time. And I kind of wish I started sooner. It seems kind of weird to ask people, but actually sometimes people do. So thank you to everyone that does subscribe. I'm really glad that you see value in the content, and let's go ahead and get started. So I have a bit of an overview of what I want to talk about today. The first thing is going to be a forward. Then I'm going to talk about some fundamental theory that you need to know going into this topic. Then I want to talk about the major and minor triads that we already know. I've done a video about those triads already, so if you haven't seen that, you can go check it out, but you should know them by now. But I'll go over them in this video briefly just to be sure. Then I want to talk about something called chord omissions, which are really handy if you want to write creative sort of songs. When I say creative, I mean you'll have more freedom because omission chords are not tied to things like major or minor. That's sort of what I was talking about at the beginning. And then at the end, we'll talk about 3 really popular chord extensions. A lot of people wouldn't even call them extensions because of how common they are, but I think of them as extensions, so I will be talking about them in that way today. So if this sounds good, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of this forward. So I make my videos in advance, total disclosure, and I try to get them out every Sunday. And for the last month, I have been working on getting my next video out. I've been really struggling because I know where I want to get to next in this video series, which is looking at functional harmony and songwriting. But I realized every time I tried making that video, there was just so much stuff that I just really didn't talk about yet. And I was trying to think about, like, where is the next thing that I go to? What is the next topic I discuss in order to get to functional harmony? And so by doing a million takes and spending a lot of time on different videos, I came up with a list of important topics to discuss leading up to functional harmony. So I guess the thing I'm saying is that in this video series, I've now done 20 videos where I talked about the cage system and all the caged chords, C major, A minor, and so on. I've also talked about a lot of practical things and some really rudimentary theory, like the chromatic scale, intervals, triads, the major scale. And using this theory, we can now start to shift gears a little, so we can start looking at the theory that ties all this stuff together in a way that's cohesive, where we can write music with it. And I'm saying that because it might feel like there's sort of an abrupt switch in the series, but actually this is the next natural step. And I thought about it for a while, and I decided that the next natural thing to discuss, following all the videos about the caged chords and the video about triads and everything, is to actually talk about alternate triads. And like I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, this is because these triads, especially the extensions in particular, they're going to make an appearance later on when we talk about the harmonized major 7th scale. And this is going to be really important because this ends up having an effect on what we know to be functional harmony, the idea of the tonic and the dominant chords. So this is really important for lots of reasons. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started now with the next thing, which is to talk about some fundamental theory you have to know. So I did already make a lot of videos about all the theory you'll need to know. So the idea here is that if you watch these videos in order and you've been following the series, then you will definitely understand what we're talking about today. But to give you the prerequisite list, if you haven't seen these videos or you don't know what these things are, you need to know the following. You need to know what the chromatic scale is, no doubt. You must know the chromatic scale. You also need to know what intervals are, what the intervallic series is. I have a PDF, like an image that I made in Procreate, which is this drawing thing, and that has all the intervals, all the simple intervals that exist. There's only 12 of them, and it's useful to memorize them. You're going to use them forever as long as you use theory. It will help also if you know what the triads are, the initial, major, and minor triads, but if you don't, we'll be going over them again today. It also helps to have a good understanding of this idea of universality, and in particular, the idea of equal temperament. This is the idea that basically each note has equal opportunity to every other note. You can make a major chord out of any note. You can make a minor chord out of any note. You can do the same with a major or minor scale and so on. That's a really important idea to try to take on board, and I talk about it often because it's so important. And I think that should do it just about for today's video. If you know those things, you should be all right in this video. So now let's go ahead and get started with the inherent major and minor chords. I'm calling them inherent major and minor chords because I think in a social, cultural way, audiences and listeners of music tend to identify majorness and minorness more than anything else. So I usually think that where we have extensions, where there's a major or minor third present, we tend to recognize the majorness of the chord before the extension. We have a sort of list of prioritization. And this is a speculation, but sort of an assessment through my experience of how we interpret, I guess, psychologically the music we hear. We tend to notice major and minor way sooner than if it's a major sixth or other things like that. So what are the major and minor triads? So I have images for this. I'll probably draw them up at some point now. But a major triad is a root. So again, because of equal temperament, we can use any note. In this case, let's just use E. So then open E string will do fine. And the perfect fifth of the root, which is in this case B. And then finally, the major third of the root. It's important that you know that the subsequent intervals, the formulas, they depend on a directionality. And what I mean by that is we are finding the intervals as they relate to the root. So this is how we actually find the notes that we use. And so these are the intervals and the spaces that we would use to make a major chord. Root, a fifth, and a major third. Now, if you want to make a minor chord, it's very similar. It's just a root and a fifth, but instead a minor third. And just that slight difference, just the slightest difference, which is now the open string, the open G string, which is the minor third of E, that makes a dramatic difference in the character of the chord. And when I say character, I mean, I say it in all my videos basically, but character meaning majorness or minorness or whatever. Major and minor. And these are the two triads we have at our disposal, and we tend to identify them sooner before others. Now let's talk about chord omissions. So chord omissions are basically where you omit that majorness or minorness. And the result is that we end up with more ambiguous chords, which is really useful. So some guidelines I have about chord omissions are that they are generally easier to play because they require less notes, fewer notes. So that's always helpful. It's also great for composition because there's no major minor conflict of interest. As you might know or could speculate from the video about the major scale that I made, majorness and minorness can clash. If you have everything sounding major or everything sounding minor, or major and minor at the wrong places at the wrong time in a scale, then you end up hearing some kind of a clash. So the great thing about omission chords is that they are handy for composition because you're not playing the major or minor third, there's no contradiction of majorness or minorness. That's really handy. So then we have kind of three different chord omission triads or formulas, as it were. The first and the most popular are called power chords. These are also known as five chords, and the reason is that they are just a root and the perfect fifth. Now, when we play them as power chords on a guitar, we tend to also add in the octave. So if we were doing this with the chord, if we were playing E5 or the power chord, it would look a bit like an E major or an E minor, except again, we're not playing the third, major third or minor third. That's important to remember. So this is an E5 actually. Now I find that E5 is a little bit harder to just hear as being a 5 chord. So my favorite example to give for 5 chords or power chords is the song I Want to Be Your Dog. This is a song by the Stooges, and it was used actually, one of my students told me about this, it was used in the movie Cruella actually. So yeah, this chord progression is a G5 or a G power chord, so a root, a fifth, and the octave of G, then the F sharp 5, root, fifth, and octave of F sharp, and then finally the same with E. And what's beautiful about this song is actually, in theory, it's more complex than most people would assume. Most people would assume because we end on E, this kind of E minor-ish shape, that you could assume that it was in the key of E minor. It's actually in the key signature of E Dorian. E Dorian is also called a mode. So modes are a complex but really, really interesting idea that I'll talk about leading up to this idea of functional harmony, especially because modes relate to the idea of majorness and minorness and how they're related. So it's beautiful. It's actually what I would almost describe as being Zen. Okay, so these are our 5 chords. So it's just a root, a perfect fifth, and an octave. That is a power chord or 5 chord. 2 other chord omissions that we have are called suspensions. So a suspension is where you play the root, the fifth, and the octave. And in this case, let's use the A major chord. Root, fifth, octave, and here we have the major third. And we have 2 different formulas here. We have 2 different suspensions, of course. So we have a suspension number 4. And what we're doing is we're substituting, we're playing instead of the major third of the A major or the minor third, we're going to play the perfect fourth. And so the formula here is a root, a perfect fifth, an octave, and the perfect fourth interval. So that's what it would look like, kind of 0, 2, 2, 3, 0, starting from the A string. That's an A sus4. That's suspension 4. And then suspension number 2, or sus2, is very similar. It's a root, a fifth, an octave, and also the major second instead of the major or minor third. That is a suspension 2 chord, and that's the formula for it. And I think an important thing to notice about this is that we are not playing the major or minor third. So they're still omission chords because they're not inherently major or minor. They're just suspended. Now I have a running theory about this, which is basically that the suspension 4 chord, because it's technically closer to the major third interval, is actually a little bit more major, if you can imagine. Whereas the suspension 2 is actually closer to the minor third interval. So it leans towards minorness, although it's worth pointing out that they should, in theory, be regarded as being neutral and suspended, sounding like you're floating in the air. I'm in the air. I'm also in the air, but maybe possibly sadder air. So that is our suspended. Those are suspended triads. Now, what I love about suspended chords and why I wanted to introduce them into this video is because in terms of practice, as far as practice goes and learning the intervallic series, all the different intervals we have at our disposal, it's really, really helpful to practice it actually. Start by playing the A sus4 and then lower your pinky so that you are playing the major 3 and now you're playing the major third interval. Now use your index finger to hold down the minor 3, A minor, right? And then remove your index finger altogether to play the major second, which makes this an A sus2. And by going through those 4 chords and identifying the note you're changing, you can easily recognize how that affects the intervallic space, which in turn has the final result on the ultimate character of the chord. So by playing A sus4, you can say, well, that's the perfect fourth, major third, minor third, major 2. And that follows the order of the intervallic series. So pretty handy. I would recommend anyone watching this to practice that because it's good to get familiar and eventually memorize all the intervals, at least simple intervals for sure. Okay, cool. Now let's turn our attention to chord extensions. Now, like I said before, some people don't call these extensions because they're so common, but I think of them as extensions. So what are chord extensions? Extensions basically serve to proliferate chords that are inherently major or inherently minor. So what does that mean? That means that we are playing a major chord or a minor chord, and we are adding one or more elements to it. And the issue with this kind of chord is that they need to be used more carefully, because because they are major or minor inherently, there is more possibility for that major minorness contradiction, which I mentioned earlier. So you need to be very careful when you're using them. But I will also say you can also throw caution to the wind. It's only music. You're not going to hurt anyone if you play something that's contradictory. And honestly, if you're willing to hear things that sound crunchy, then power to you, because it will be all the more musically and theoretically stimulating. You'll probably ask, why does this sound so crunchy? You know, if you start playing chords like, I don't know, like, you'll start saying, why is this like what it is? And you'll eventually get answers, which is sort of the goal ultimately, to begin your own course of inquiry. So, okay, what are the 3 chord extensions that we're going to talk about today? So these are really important extensions, and they include a major 7th, a minor 7th, and a dominant chord formula. Each of these are just one formula that we have for each. And again, you can apply it to any note because of equal temperament. Now let's just start with the first, the major 7th. So let's use A again, because actually A is probably the best chord for demonstrating all of these kind of chord extensions and variations. So the A major 7th chord, or any major 7th chord, is comprised of a root, a 5th, and a major 3rd. So it's already just a major chord. Yep, just a good old-fashioned major chord, but we are adding in a major 7th interval. Now, where do we get the major 7th? So actually, in this variation of fretting, we hold down the 2nd fret of the G string, which happens to be the octave. Now, the major 7th interval is really close to the octave. It's only one semitone flat of it. So that is a major 7th interval. So the result is we play 0, 2, 1, 2, 0, starting from the open A string. And that is a major 7th chord. That is our formula. And you could apply that formula with any of the other chord shapes that we looked at in the cage system and get a major 7th sound out. Major 7th chords are especially handy because the major 7th interval is also technically, depending on directionality, again, what I call a reciprocal interval. It is a minor second away from the following note before you get to the octave again. So because of that, there's this majorness and minorness to it, which allows you to move it around more liberally. And there's a little bit more wiggle room in what you can do with it. So they're really fun to use, and they sound super relaxed, and they sound sophisticated. So they're nice to use for that reason too. So, okay, let's talk about another chord extension. This is the minor 7th. So this is a very similar kind of notion. Oh, one thing I need to mention about the major 7th, which I'm going to mention now about the minor 7th. The major 7th, notice that it was the root, the perfect 5th, the major 7th, and major 3rd. Notice that there's congruency, that there's major and major again. So there's no minor elements that appear here. This is important. That's why it sounds cohesive. Everything sounds major, more or less, you know? We have a root, a neutral element of a perfect 5th, a major 3rd, and a major 7th. So there's no major minor conflict of interest. This is important. Now let's talk about the minor 7th. The minor 7th is similar as well. It's congruent in its minorness. So it's just like a minor chord. So it's a root, a 5th, and a minor 3rd. But instead of the octave, we're going to do something similar. We're going to flatten the octave, but instead we're going to flatten it by a whole step to get to our minor 7th. And the minor 7th inside of a minor chord, the minor 7th inside of a minor chord is congruent. It sounds like as you'd expect. Root, 5th, minor 7th, minor 3rd. And then we have a repeat of the 5th. And that is our minor 7th triad, or formula, I guess. Okay, cool. Now let's talk about where there is a conflict, major minor conflict of interest. The dominant chord. The dominant chord is probably one of the most important chords out of the bunch, especially for songwriting. And I'm saying that because hopefully you can take note of it, digest that. You can speculate on it too and just sort of say, well, why? And I'll sort of try to explain now why, but let's just start with that formula. So the dominant chord is actually just a major chord. Oops. So it's a major chord. Oops, kind of loud. A major chord, but instead of with a major seventh, the minor seventh. So it's a root, a fifth, a major third, a minor seventh, crunch. And that is our dominant chord. Now they're also called seven chords. Now there is it's a specific nuance, it's a subtlety to take note of. Major seventh chords are always called major seven. We specify that it's a major seven. Whereas dominant chords are usually called dominant, but if you're writing them down, you would actually call them the name of the chord. So in this case, A and seven, just the number seven. You wouldn't say minor seven. You would just say A7. And this, of course, is to avoid getting confused with the minor seventh chord, which is the root, the fifth, the minor third, and the minor seventh. So, okay, so that is our formula. Now, what about this conflict of interest? This, I'm not saying it's contradictory. It doesn't work. It does work. But what it does do is introduce tension. We hear something fundamentally major and minor at the same time. This leads to a lot of tension, which is, within reason, very desirable in music. We don't want to hear something that just sounds monotonous. People tend to like when things sound interesting and unexpected in terms of writing and even with chords. So dominant chords are very handy for introducing an amount of tension that is more or less very acceptable to our palate. It's a very palatable amount of tension. And because of the tension with the major and minor, it allows for a lot of different possibilities going forward with composition. So definitely dominant chords are chords to take note of. Now, in terms of this idea of majorness and recognizing intervallic spaces, like we did before with the suspension, that whole exercise I spelled out. Another exercise and something to practice with major seventh and the major chords and such is I would recommend the following progression. Now this progression goes from a major chord, so we'll do A major, and we'll go to the major seventh, and then remove the major seventh, but leave the chord dominant, leave the chord major. So you have a minor seventh and the major third. And go back to the major seventh. This is a song by the band Sixpence None the Richer, very famous song called Kiss Me. And what's great about this exercise is that you can start to get familiar, just like with the suspension exercise I gave earlier. The great thing about this exercise is you can explore the sound difference between the octave, major seventh, minor seventh, major seventh, and get familiar with this idea of spaces and how they move proportionately as you adjust the fret spacing. And this is really where we start to translate the practical, the cerebral theory to a practical environment, where we can say, that's the octave, therefore this is the major seventh, that is the minor seventh. And the song would be strummed. Yeah. Now, I would also like to just bring about this final observation, this universal observation, which is important to consider here, which is that these chords can be done, these alternate chords and variations and omissions, they can be done with any note. Again, I said it before, but equal temperament tells us that you can play an A major seventh, A dominant. You can do it with the D chord as well. You can do it with any note. You can start from any note being your root, because each note is of equal value to every other note. So we start with, say, for instance, the D major chord. You'll find that by learning each of the intervallic elements in this chord shape, that you can adjust them equally to produce things like the suspension 4, the suspension 2, or also things like the major seventh or dominant. For instance, the D major can be played as a D sus4 very easily. just by sharpening the major 3. And in order to do this, you have to recognize which note is the major third, the relative major third of the root. So it's the second fret of the E string, that is our major third, the note F sharp. If we sharpen it, then it goes from a major third to a suspension 4, perfect fourth. That is the D sus4. If you remove that finger altogether, you would be playing the D sus2. D sus2, D major, D sus4. Same with major 7th, actually. D happens to work very well for this. D major includes the octave here with our ring finger. If you flatten it though, that's our major 7th. If you flatten that same note one more time, so it's the open D, 2nd fret on the G string, 1st fret on the B string, followed by the 2nd fret on the open E string, that's our D7. So you could actually do the progression that we just talked about, A major 7, A dominant. You could do that actually from D. D major 7th, D dominant, D major 7th. And so it's worth considering that this practice of identifying the intervallic notes in any chord shape specific to the cage system is going to be hugely empowering as well. So that just about does it for this video. I hope you found it informative and helpful. You should now know a lot about different chord extensions and variations that you can try now to spice things up and sort of make your songwriting a little bit more interesting. And if you did like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to stay in the loop. And of course, it motivates me to keep making content. Thank you to everyone that has seen this video and does subscribe. It really does mean a lot. If you still have some questions, write something in the comments below, or of course, you're always welcome to reach out for a free first lesson. I have a link in the description, and I'll see you at the next video. Ciao for now.